Just as tensions reached their peak, the second officer took a step forward, his voice calm but commanding. "Let's take a step back and sort this out properly," he said, signaling the first officer to release Mrs. Jackson. Reluctantly, he did, stepping away as the attorney and Marcus moved to her side to ensure she was okay. The woman with the phone held her ground, stating firmly that she would hand over the footage only to an independent investigator, which drew cheers from the crowd. But just when it seemed the situation might de-escalate, a final twist emerged. Another man stepped out from the crowd, quietly approaching the officers. He flashed a badge. He was an off-duty internal affairs investigator who had witnessed the entire scene. The crowd gasped as he began taking statements, starting with Mrs. Jackson, Marcus, and the woman with the video evidence. The first officer, now pale and visibly shaken, stuttered through his explanation, but the investigator's sharp gaze never wavered. As the crowd watched, the investigator promised a full review of the incident, ensuring justice would be served. For Mrs. Jackson, it was a moment of relief, but the unexpected arrival of someone from within the system gave everyone hope that this story wouldn't end quietly, and it didn't. In the weeks that followed, the footage from the scene went viral, sparking outrage and conversations about accountability. Mrs. Jackson, still shaken by the incident, received an outpouring of support from her community. Marcus and the woman who recorded the video became key figures in a movement demanding change within the police department. The off-duty investigator's report led to the first officer being placed under suspension, with a formal investigation launched into his conduct. Mrs. Jackson later shared her story in a local town hall, emphasizing the importance of standing up for what's right, even in the face of fear. "I wasn't alone that day," she said, her voice steady, "and that made all the difference." The incident became a catalyst for reform, with new training implemented to prevent similar situations. While the day had started with injustice, it ended with a powerful reminder of the strength in unity and action. A routine traffic stop turns into a nightmare when a police officer drags a black disabled woman out of her car. Witnesses stand frozen, some recording the scene as her cries for help echo through the street. What starts as an ordinary day spirals into an event that leaves everyone questioning what they've just seen. Who is this woman, and why did the officer escalate the situation so quickly? As tensions rise, a stranger steps in, challenging the officer's actions in a way no one saw coming. What happens next will leave everyone stunned and spark a conversation that goes far beyond this one moment. Stay tuned to uncover the truth behind this incident and the ripple effects that follow. It's a story of injustice, courage, and the surprising power of one person's stand. The woman, known in her community as Mrs. Jackson, is a well-loved school teacher who uses a wheelchair due to a recent accident. That morning, she was on her way to pick up supplies for her students when flashing lights appeared in her rearview mirror. She pulled over, confused but calm, wondering what could have gone wrong. The officer approached, his tone sharp from the start. Witnesses recall him asking her to step out of the car, despite her explaining she was physically unable to do so. As Mrs. Jackson tried to explain further, the officer's impatience grew, and what happened next shocked onlookers. With no regard for her condition, he forcefully attempted to pull her from the car. People on the street began recording, shouting for him to stop, but he ignored them. Then, a bystander stepped forward, determined to intervene, and this bold act changed everything. The bystander, a young man named Marcus, couldn't stand by any longer. Known in the neighborhood for his activism, Marcus quickly stepped between the officer and Mrs. Jackson. He raised his hands, keeping his voice calm but firm, asking the officer why he wasn't following protocol for disabled individuals. The tension thickened as the officer ordered Marcus to back away, but Marcus didn't move. Instead, he pointed to the growing crowd of witnesses recording the scene. Meanwhile, Mrs. Jackson's voice trembled as she pleaded for someone to call her daughter, who she had been heading to meet. Her car was still running, her groceries scattered in the back seat, but no one knew how things would escalate next. Some onlookers whispered about filing complaints later, while others shouted in frustration, urging the officer to stop. It seemed like the moment could boil over at any second, and then a second police car pulled up. As the second police car pulled up, the crowd held its breath. Another officer stepped out, observing the chaos with a tense expression. Marcus took a step back, hoping this officer might de-escalate the situation, but Mrs. Jackson's face showed nothing but fear. The first officer, still gripping her arm, muttered something to his colleague, who nodded but kept his distance for a moment, scanning the crowd. The onlookers grew louder, some shouting for justice, while others demanded answers. Marcus turned to the second officer, explaining Mrs. Jackson's disability and pleading for someone to listen. The officer hesitated, his hand hovering near his radio, as though weighing his options. Meanwhile, Mrs. Jackson tried to compose herself, tears streaming down her face as she begged for someone to believe her. Then, out of nowhere, a voice from the crowd shouted, "I have it all on camera." All eyes turned toward a woman holding her phone high, and the energy of the moment shifted dramatically. The woman with the phone stepped forward, her voice steady as she said, "Everything from the moment you pulled her over is recorded." The crowd grew quiet, the tension shifting as all eyes locked on the officers. The second officer approached her cautiously, asking to see the footage, but she refused, holding the phone tightly. "This needs to go to someone who will actually do something about it," she said, her words sparking murmurs of agreement from the bystanders. The first officer's demeanor changed, his grip on Mrs. Jackson loosening as he glanced nervously at the growing crowd. But before anyone could take a breath, another twist unfolded. From behind the crowd, a man in a business suit emerged, identifying himself as an attorney who had been driving by. He introduced himself as Mr. Collins and immediately began asking the officers pointed questions, his tone professional but firm. The officers exchanged glances, clearly unsettled by his presence. "Why wasn't a disability expert called to assist?" Mr. Collins asked. The first officer stammered, caught off guard, while the second officer appeared increasingly uneasy. Marcus stood beside the attorney, backing him up, while the crowd buzzed with anticipation. Everyone could feel the situation reaching a boiling point, but no one knew what would happen next.